I'll start us off. So, hi again, everyone. I'm Mashara Davis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Vice President of Political and Civic Engagement here at Women Engaged. I was raised here in Georgia, so it's great to be home. I moved back here in March. I spent the last couple of years in the DC, Virginia area working with a national nonprofit organization, and so, really happy to just take a deep dive into the work happening on the ground with an organization like Women Engaged. I also have the pleasure of serving as the youngest vice chair of the Pro Georgia Board of Directors. So, thank you so much, Netroots, for having me, and looking forward to jumping into this conversation. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michelle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm the COO of Women Engaged. I was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, not Kansas, and I enjoy playing video games and streaming online. I've been working in community organizing in the nonprofit sector for about 15 years, and just recently completed my fellowship with the Rockwood Institute for their 2021 Reproductive Health Rights and Justice Fellowship Program. And so I'm really excited to be here with you all as we dig deep into how in Georgia we made 2020 what it was and how we continue to mobilize young people, especially Gen Z and millennials, into activating in that way. And so just to give a little bit of background about who we are, specifically talking about Women Engaged, we were an organization that was founded in 2014 by Malika Redmond and Margaret Carpo that really just wanted to address some of the topics of conversation that were going on, especially when it comes to BIPOC communities, in terms of like, given the context, people didn't think that people would turn out the same way that they did when Obama was elected in 2021. And so our founders sought to disprove that and show that what really needed to happen was a deeper investment in our communities to make sure that we are inspiring change that is at the intersections of our various identities and continues to center the most marginalized. That's why our mission works to develop impactful leaders around the issues that impact Black women, femmes, and girls. And through this, we use a model called integrated voter engagement through our signature We Vote, We Rise program.
Thanks, Michelle. And so just to give a bit more of a highlights of why we use an integrated voter engagement model. So at Women Engaged, we host 3 campaigns throughout the year. One focused on issue advocacy, right? We want to make sure that as we are highlighting different issues that are of importance to community, we are speaking directly to the community to understand what their needs are, so we can highlight and lift those up to elected officials. We also focus on voter registration. Here in Georgia, about 95% of eligible voters are registered, which is great. However, during our campaign, not only did we register several hundred folks, we also made sure that folks were checking their status. We know that a lot of people voted in the runoff, right, in the general, but people have also moved and they changed their names. So we were making sure that we were in community, making sure that they were registered to vote. We also right now are in our GOTV campaign. We are ensuring that once folks are registered, we're touching them again via call, via text, social media, making sure that they actually have the tools that they need to be successful and to be an informed voter when they cast their ballot next month, either in person at the polls or absentee. And we've learned that through this integrated voter engagement model, it's necessary because typically we'll have, campaigns come into a state, do great work, right? And we want to make sure that we are building those relationships on an ongoing basis and being able to be of support to our community, being able to answer questions. And, for example, here in Georgia, we've had several voter suppression bills, and one that comes to mind is SB 202, and it changes so much of our election law and voting law that we want to make sure that the community is aware and educated, and we're able to do that through this integrated voter engagement model. All right, so that was just a little bit of the taste of what we're going to go into for this session. Just to give you an idea of our agenda, we're going to do a review of 2020 and 2021, talk a little bit about recruitment for our campus team and how we've been able to engage young folks, particularly Gen Z and millennials, talk about messaging, how do we engage with young people to bring them into the fold, to become civically involved, and then to encourage their friends and family to get involved. We're going to take a deep dive into leadership development and talk about data collection and analysis and what that's looked like for us. So in 2020, we had a major shift to digital, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk about what that looked like.
Yes. Thank you, Michelle. I always feel that, we have to start off with the context and the conversation in which, has led to why we are virtual right now, which is that, we are fortunate that we have leadership that really was taking note of what was going on. We switched to digital 2 weeks before any of our partners took that step, before it was considered a pandemic, which really helped us to adjust and work to fill in the gaps in terms of making sure that people had equipment, that they needed cell phones, computers, hotspots, so then that way they can continue working. Also, making sure that we're addressing some of the technical gaps and divides. So understanding that for a lot of folks, there was a growing technical divide that was already happening, but it just kind of was in hyperspeed once the pandemic really set on. And so we started providing technical assistance, one-on-one trainings with folks, sometimes even making house calls to make sure that people had what they needed. The other part that we did too was train people in crisis call management, because we understood, at the time, we didn't know for how long things would be going, but knew that we wanted to make sure that our community was safe and that they had information about the resources that were available to them. Especially given the fact that like a lot of information was currently couched on social media in terms of mutual aid funds. And for anyone who's really deep into social media, you already know if you're not friends with certain people, you're not going to see certain content. So we wanted to make sure that we bridged that gap. And over the course of the year, we were able to help over 1,000 people get access to resources in their communities by having phone and text banks throughout the year and following up in those conversations. On top of that, one thing that we did was that we also made sure to center the humanity of our team members. We were able to raise their hourly wages from $15 to $17 an hour. On top of that, be able to provide other COVID relief items in order to help them purchase groceries and things of that nature as well. And we found that this was definitely in value alignment with the work that we did. And so I feel like we have to start with that conversation of how we come into 2020 and knowing that because of that growing digital divide, we had to get very, very creative and innovative about how we were going to get messaging out to people, especially because with everyone going digital, things were very overly saturated. And so some of the tactics that we're going to go into today is going to talk about how we can kind of overcome some of those things and how we actually did that going into the 2020 elections this year. So I'm going to pass it over to Michelle to talk a little bit more about our impact.
Thanks, Michelle. So I want to highlight a couple of things. As mentioned, with that shift to digital, engaging in digital, it can be fun, it can be exciting, right? But to your point, Michelle, it can become oversaturating, right, within our communities. And so we were very strategic about how we connected with our community. And we work across 8 different counties here in Georgia. And so we used phone banks, we used text banks, we reached out to community in other ways, for example, with relational organizing. And just to kind of give a sense of the breadth of our programs, we actually engaged in conversation with 720,000 voters via text messaging. And we also conducted conversations with 50,000 voters via phone. And that was just in 2020 alone. And then when we look at the 2021 runoff here in Georgia, we know all eyes were on Georgia for the runoff here for U.S. Senate. And so we were able to engage in 100,000 text conversations, 25,000 plus phone conversations. And we also conducted digital outreach impressions, which reached over 6,000. And so just to kind of give a better sense, when we say digital outreach across platforms, so for example, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, engaging with community through relational organizing, whether that's phone or text, but making sure that we're also reaching within community, but also reaching within the folks that we speak to on a regular basis, just our friends and family. So between 2020 and 2021, continuing with that digital outreach for us was really important. And it was a way for us to be able to engage with community in a safe manner, given COVID-19. And so just to provide a bit more context here, like I mentioned, some of the tools that we were able to use, for example, through Talk, we were able to use Spoke to conduct our text messaging program. And the great thing about having access to these tools is that we're able to connect with a significant amount of people within a shorter period of time. I know Michelle's going to talk a bit more about our Canvas team. And so having a 15-member Canvas team use these tools, it significantly helped us be able to reach even more voters than we've had in some of our previous years. It also allowed us to really document the different touch points with our voters, and we'll talk a little bit more about that during our data collection and analysis portion of the presentation. And I will turn it back over to my colleague, Michelle.
Yes, thank you. And so what's amazing about our team is that our team is comprised of about 60 to 70% of Gen Z and millennials. With out of that 60 to 70%, about 80% of those are Gen Z. And so I'm really excited that for some of them, we have retained them for many cycles now, some of them 2 years worth of cycles. We do this work year round, so that's 3 campaigns, so they're just sticking with us. And so these are some of their faces. I think it's really important that we continue to center these kind of conversations and really start thinking about, the individuals and young people in this way, because what's really dynamic about young people in particular is that it's really important to address them as a whole person and not necessarily couch them as, oh, that's just a young person. And so I find that their stories and the things that they contribute and the ways that they learn and grow through our leadership development programs and other ways that we have for them really showcases the reason why we're able to recruit and retain them. And so on the next slide, there's a video about a young person. Their name is Courtney. They joined us about 2 to 3 years ago doing this work, and actually was really inspired by another presentation that I did at their university. And from there, once they started, they just hit the ground running, recruiting their friends through what is now coined as the term relational organizing, even though I will always say relational organizing is not new to BIPOC folks, okay? It's a tactic that we have always used. And so, definitely tapping into those networks. And we'll talk a little bit more about relational organizing and how that's a great tool for organizing Gen Z and millennials. But I just want you all to hear a little bit about some of the reasons why Courtney is inspired to do this as we continue to center this conversation around young people.
For me, the first time that I went to go vote was super exciting. I just remember thinking to myself that I need to be a part of this, because I understood that this wasn't just a vote for me and what I cared about, but it was also a vote for my community. Get issues talked about or get issues fixed that were very important to me. I think growing up at a young age, my parents always stressed the importance of going to go vote. So when I finally got the opportunity to do so, I definitely made it a point to do that. And I think that we have to stress why you should go vote. If people don't understand why it matters, then they kind of lose interest in it. I knew that I wasn't just speaking out for me, I was speaking out for people younger than me who actually couldn't go vote. And I think that is super important. And I'm super excited to be a part of all the history that has been made thus far in Georgia.
And so that was a little bit from Courtney, but this was a part of a series that we call Voter Stories. You can find more of them on our YouTube page. But what's really impactful is that with Courtney's story, when they first came to us, did not see voting in that same way. But because of the work that we do and how we mobilize them, they were able to continue to grow and see the power of their civic engagement, as well as learning about a host of other things. And so this brings me on to recruitment and how we continue to get young people like Courtney and many others into our team. And so one thing I will say is that before the pandemic, it was definitely about frequenting the spaces in which young people are. But the next part is also making sure that we're frequenting the digital spaces where young people are. And so I know for myself included, when the pandemic first started, I got TikTok just for fun. And now that's a part of my nightly ritual. And so it's really important that we continue to steep ourselves in the spaces where people are at, but also being able to be cognizant of what that means in terms of our engagement. One thing I will always say is that it's really important to invest in young people and young leaders in order to have these kind of conversations. So you always want to make sure you're not just kind of dropping in as a person and then talking at someone. And so Really important to just have that in mind as we talk about recruitment. And that what we have found in terms of our tactics is that, again, we're frequenting the spaces in which people are. In fact, we're at a festival this weekend, of course, safely and given the context of the pandemic. We are in colleges and universities, but we're also making sure that we're having people talk to other people. And that's really what's at the heart of our team. We have been able to really keep a retention that's close to almost 60% with our team members over the past few years because of this way. And it starts with recruitment, because what happens is that you bring in dynamic folks like Courtney, who are then able to have conversations with other people, and then they become your biggest recruiters. And so it's really important that we position young people in places of empowerment where they can have these kind of conversations. And so if we can go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about messaging. And the biggest thing about messaging is really around demystifying these conversations around young people. And it's something where I am a huge advocate about. And so oftentimes what happens is that when it comes to the issues that are impacting young people, it's oftentimes discounted or sometimes couched as like folks who are quote unquote not doing enough. And a lot of times it's really rooted in capitalism or racism or sexism, any of the oppressive systems that be. But what's important is that we address young people's full humanity and what's current for them. And I think that I definitely relate with this as a millennial where, oftentimes in my early 20s, people were coming after me and talking about, avocado toast this. And if you just stop going to Starbucks, that, even though I didn't do any of those things at the time. And so it's really important that in these kind of conversations, especially in movement work, that we continue to demystify these conversations. And also, too, that we're not couching young people just because there's a certain demographic, meaning that we're not couching saying that all young people are good at social media because young people use social media. Or that we're saying that all young people are great at technology because they grew up with technology, because that's not always the case. And it can oftentimes lead to an issue where folks are afraid to speak up if they need help. And so it's really important that we have that as well. And so this is where it comes back to the perspective of centering the whole person. You want to make sure that you're having these kind of conversations that really addresses each person as an individual and really gets input from them. But the thing that makes our program unique, and also what helps with the retention of it, is that each of our canvassers are able to have a say in the work that we do. And so making sure that we are able to have these kind of conversations in a way that empowers them to give feedback and to have some say and agency in it is really what gives it. Because again, national organizations or some national campaigns will come and parachute and tell people what they need to do. But we believe that people are the experts of their own experiences. And that takes the ability to walk that in these kind of conversations with young people. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to talk a little bit more about what that means programmatically.
Thanks, Michelle. So to highlight a couple of things here. So as we are recruiting young folks to work with our campaigns, I want to just highlight once again that the folks that we're hiring, they work directly in the communities that we work in. They live and work in those communities, and we work across 8 different counties. So Fulton, DeKalb, Henry, Cobb, Clayton, Douglas, Rockdale, and Gwinnett. And so the beautiful thing is that not only are they able to connect with voters in the community, right? But these are their friends and neighbors. And so as they're connecting with voters through our program, they're also able to learn more about some of the tech tools that we're using, right? I mentioned Spoke and Through Talk and VAN, the Voter Activation Network. And so when they are being recruited to work with organizations, they are informed that they're able to learn how to use these tools and add the tools to their suite. And they can really have transferable skills that they can also take along with them to other organizations, because we recognize that our intergenerational campus team, for the folks who are recent college graduates, and maybe this is their first time job, their first job coming out of undergrad, they're able to learn so much on the job. And like I said, it can become transferable. Also around leadership development. So Michelle mentioned that they're also informing us what they want to learn. So during our shifts, each week we have what's called We Lead. So these We Lead tech hours essentially are opportunities for them to learn more about the reproductive justice space, to learn more about the civic engagement ecosystem and how to be civically engaged, right? How to be a change agent. And so this is all part of our recruitment process. When we go through the legislative process or the legislative season, which we'll be actually preparing for right after this election for the top of the year, they're able to be involved and learn how to engage with elected officials, learn how to engage with folks who are running for office in their respective communities, and feel confident in those conversations to share with them issues that are important to them, their families, and their communities. We also have folks on the Canvas team who are interested in digital engagement, being able to learn, like Michelle mentioned, just because you're a young person, we shouldn't have the assumption that they're an expert on social media. Although I have to give it to our Canvas team, they are experts. I have to give it to them when it comes to social media, and I'm happy that they are able to lift up what they would like to learn when it comes to digital engagement, as well as share with us ways that we can increase our our breadth within the organization and within community. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to talk about our leadership development.
Yeah, so Mashara mentioned it before, but we have these weekly hours, and I think what the biggest takeaway is that we have to be very intentional about scheduling this time with our team members, especially when it comes to the retention and recruitment of it. I think oftentimes, and this is also too a part of what integrated voter engagement is about, in terms of it doesn't stop with just one-off pieces of engagement or that we pigeonhole people into one perspective, but that we offer opportunities for growth. And I say this all the time, it's like, don't get afraid to get meta about your leadership development, in a sense that with our organization, we use the framework of reproductive justice, and we can definitely talk about that. But sometimes we could just have a leadership development time that just talks about what is a leader and what makes a leader. Really asking some of these core questions about how people can see themselves in the movement is also another way to really break it down and really invest deeply into someone's development. The other part about this too is also making sure that we are strengthening our partnerships and offering opportunities with other organizations who are doing similar work with you and having them report back. There have been times that we have had people on our teams who take part in other trainings and other sessions and are able to come back and share with others and lead workshops and talk about those various things as well. The other thing too is that, again, we have a staircase model where people are able to empower themselves to take on various leadership roles and responsibilities. And so one thing I didn't mention was how in 2020 we were able to elevate about 3 members in our Canvas team to digital organizers who continue to make TikToks and messaging and continue to add in their input. And then we gave them the tools and the training necessary to become digital organizers, like learning the analytics, learning those various things. And this is all a part of how we made that leadership development very intentional with the hours that were given to them. And so when it comes to this leadership development piece, it's a very core part of our strategy, especially within the model of integrated voter engagement. It's something that continues to keep someone going and also continues to really meet people where they are and provide them with the tools necessary to feel empowered to advocate for the issues that matter most to them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those tactics are. So what does that look like in terms of continuing that retention and things like that? And so the first thing, of course, is hosting one-on-one conversations. So if you have someone who's on your team, dedicating some time, maybe like once a month or once a quarter, where you're doing a deep one-on-one conversation, that's really to learn what their plan is, or if they have a plan at all. And so sometimes what I like to do is that starts off in the conversation as far as like developing a mission statement or a vision statement about how they envision themselves, and us creating a plan of growth or action and being able to connect them with that. I've already mentioned about leadership development. The next part is that relational organizing, which again is not new to BIPOC organizing. However, when we talk about the intentionality of maybe not even just curating a list of people, but it's the idea of being able to contact people in your network, have them take an action with you, but continue to have conversations with them so they can take further action with you and maybe later down the line join the team. And so using Courtney for example, was able to talk to her friends, have them take our pledge to vote, have them register to vote, and then also turned around and recruited them onto the team, right? This is a staircase and a tactic that's very useful, and we actually got to see it at hand when it came to the 2020 elections, where in like 2 short weeks, we had a digital pledge card, and through relational organizing alone with our team members, were able to garner over 600 signatures in that time frame. And that's 600 signatures working roughly, I want to say, 6 hours each week on that exact task. So they spend roughly 12 hours. And so it's really important that we continue to really invest deeply in relational organizing, the tools that are necessary, and also give people the information and messaging so they can have those conversations with people. Because what we're finding is that, especially amongst Gen Z, is that it's really important for them to hear it from a certain type of person rather than a big personality. So this idea of investing in celebrity to come in and speak to young people is not really the most effective tool. What really is effective is that we're empowering people who know someone to have these kind of conversations, and then also to kind of demystifies the process, where a lot of times we often assume that the people who are in our network are doing the same things that we do because that's our relationship with them. Like, you have a friend that you've known for 5-10 years and you're like, yeah, like, we are all registered to vote. And then if you've never had that kind of conversation, do you really know? Right? And so we empower people to kind of make these conversations normal and normalizing these things. And so it's really important to really do that. The next part is recognition and celebration, which I think is just a part of any tactic for retention and recruitment, even not just for young people, but for people in general, making sure that we are giving the recognition where it's due, that we're celebrating the wins that people have, and that we're continuing to appreciate people and what they bring to the team. The next thing is social media storms. So again, being able to take social media by storm, using Twitter storms, using other ways to get connected. And sometimes these storms can also happen within groups. One thing that we do is that we are a part of a lot of neighborhood groups where we have frequented in the past, in order to make sure that we stay connected and stay rooted. And there we're also to send our messaging as well to get out any information in terms of, like, if we're hiring, elections that are coming up, anything that's going on. And then last but not least, and something that I thought it was really important, is that, like, you got to make it fun. You got to make it fun and engaging and find new ways to engage with folks. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a gamer. I love video games. And one thing that was really helpful for us was that at the height of, like, in that period between the general and the runoff election in January, we hosted a game-a-thon where we played Among Us and just had conversations about how it related back to why you need to vote. And so for folks who are not familiar, Among Us is a mobile video game. You can also play it on your desktop, where you're on a ship with a crew of people and you have to figure out who was the alien killer before they kill everyone. And you also have to complete your task. Now, what makes this fun is that you have to vote each time, right? And so you can see where this is kind of going, but we were able to kind of tie it back to voting. And this was a new way to, again, to engage our folks in a way that they may not have been engaged about, finding these ways to connect the issues, but also having fun with it. And I think that's really important, because sometimes what can happen is that folks get very graphic heavy, get very information heavy. And right now, especially in the context of the global pandemic, life is already heavy enough. And so it's really important that we continue to still have fun with the way that we're having this kind of engagement, because that's really what's going to make you stand out. So I figured, find that inner child, talk to some folks and figure out ways to really reach people that's really going to be fun and engaging for them. So then that way, that's what they're taking with them too, because what it is that people oftentimes remember how you made them feel more so than what you actually told them in that initial encounter. So it's important that people leave with a feeling, knowing that, wow, this organization or these group of folks are really about it, but they're also really fun, and I want to stay engaged with them. And so that's some of the tactics that we use. And so I'm going to turn over to Michelle to talk a little bit about data.
Thanks, Michelle. And yes, plus 100, plus 100 on keeping it fun and having a good time with this. Honestly, I think that can count as both a recruitment tactic, but also a retention tactic, right? And so when we're in our canvas shifts and organizers, our campaign team, they're ready to, dig into the work, right? But they're also looking to have a good time, and being able to connect that back to voting is so important. And it makes me think about, some of our newer canvassers, right? They're just very new to civic engagement. I think it's a way for them to also learn, right, how all of these different pieces fit together. So absolutely. So when it comes to data, we're talking about having all these conversations, right? So what does that look like on the back end? We want to be able to track our conversations and also track our level of engagement within our service area, right? So not only we can evaluate our programs, but we can determine what is our impact when we're registering people to vote, and we want to determine of the people we registered, how many actually went out and took action, right? And then for the folks who may not have taken action, what does it look like as we recalibrate our programs going into the next year? So I want to talk a little bit about these couple of points here. One, definitions. It's really important to have clear definitions across within your organization, but particularly across partnerships, right? If you're working in coalition with other organizations, and particularly when you have funders you have to submit reports to, you want to have a clear sense of terminology, right? And also a clear sense of how you're describing your data. Just to give you an example, when we talk about a dynamic script, that looks a little different across through talk versus spoke versus in van, right? So just having a very clear sense of what does that terminology actually look like and making sure we're all on the same page. Also, centralization. So this is important. So organizations, whether you're 1 year old or 5 years or 20 years old, it's important to make sure that we have those clear definitions across years, right? But then we're also able to centralize our data so that way we can present the work that's taking place and we can showcase with ease the work that we're doing within community. So having your data reports very organized and whatever tool that you're using, making sure that you are doing that in a very clean fashion. Also, training. I remember working on a campaign in New Hampshire, and our state director used to always say the best volunteer is a trained volunteer. And that applies to canvassers as well. So we are training our canvas team on how to use the tools. We also have the opportunity to work with a dynamic organization here in Georgia, which is called Pro Georgia. They are a state affiliate of the State Voices Network, which is actually where we are able to gain access to many of the tools that we use. And so they also provide training to the tools. So that way we can make sure that our Canvas team, they feel confident and they feel comfortable when they're using the tools to do the work. And then also this piece around beyond data points is really important, because when we're looking at an Excel spreadsheet or we're looking at data in Van, we want to make sure that we're looking beyond just the data points, right? For example, if we're looking at a sheet with 100,000 voters, we're not just looking at roles on an Excel spreadsheet. We're actually looking at individual people, and there's a story behind that. And so when we talk about being able to see the story and really build that narrative, it's important to recognize that it's not just people on just points on a piece of paper. It's actually a life behind the data that we're viewing. So that's really important to keep in mind. And it also allows us to think about how data can be powerful, right? And we want to make sure that data is not weaponized against the communities that we're working in. So really highlighting the stories and really being able to lift up what's happening in community, all of that can happen using data. All right, we are moving right along in our presentation. And so really just want to take a moment to have some final thoughts on this session of how to mobilize millennials and Gen Zers, to really save democracy. And so this first piece here, just really taking that deeper investment within, people of color, BIPOC, young, queer leadership is so critically important. And, Michelle and I, we both came into this work as young organizers. And so being able to really lift up our young people, wrap our arms around them, approach them in love, and, have opportunities for training and development is so important. And that's something that we believe strongly in here at Women Engaged.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I would add as well, like, when it comes to the question of like how we mobilize young people, especially Gen Zs and millennials, and then that's a question that folks are trying to figure out, we have to first start with, are we even hiring or employing young people, right? And that's something that each organization has to really take a look at, because if you're looking at your leadership that you have for your program or for the campaign that you have, and you notice that there's not a young person in that room, that's a problem. And so when it comes to that deeper investment, it's definitely around like the leadership development, the volunteer opportunities, things like that. But it really got to put money where it really matters. And if the idea is around mobilizing young people, we have to really invest in young people. Because again, it's really about, what's current, And so going back to my previous point in terms of young people right now, many of us included are facing student loan debt that's higher than any generation has ever seen. We are also facing a housing crisis where many of us are being priced out of the home cities that we used to frequent. I know that is definitely true here in Atlanta, where a lot of Atlanta natives who, looked forward to buying a house similar to the one they grew up in cannot afford that house because now it's $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 more than what it's supposed to be. And so again, that's why we really have to talk about what that investment looks like and that deeper appreciation. And so going on to like relational organizing, again, it's really important that we continue to empower people to have these conversations with their networks. When it comes to Gen Zers, they are not on Facebook as often as older generations right now. In fact, a lot of millennials are rarely on Facebook ourselves anymore either. A lot of folks are looking at Instagram, and I'm definitely in awe in the ways in which young people have used TikTok to organize, especially during the uprisings last year. But it's really important to realize nowadays that more than ever, relational organizing is where it's at. So making sure that we're deeply investing in what those connections look like, and know that from a budgetary standpoint, that's going to look different than how we invest in, let's say, like a cold text bank or a cold phone bank. So making sure that we are really giving people the tools that are necessary to have these common conversations.
Absolutely. And the piece around providing opportunities for growth, we talked about having a staircase, right? And so there are many organizations that, have a similar model, and being able to implement that into your organization can really help young people get involved, right? And we know sometimes that first step may seem a little intimidating for someone maybe who's new to this space, but being able to have that letter of engagement really can empower them to get involved and also encourage their friends and family to become civically engaged.
Yes, and I see there's a question in the chat about specific examples of messages or poll questions or personal stories from an organizer at the door that have been most effective. I will say one is that it varies, to be completely honest. But I say that it's always about, you want to have the ability to really like understand where people are coming from and really be able to talk about the issues, because when it comes to voting in particular, what we have found is that when you talk about top of the ticket races, so like president, things like that, people oftentimes have a very reaction, in a sense that they're not the most excited to have a conversation about who they're voting for president. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of miseducation in which, who holds the power in terms of certain things. Like people who think that the president has the power of the purse when hopefully we know that Congress passes the funding bill for the government and various things like that, right? So what we have found, especially with the communities that we work, is that it's really important to talk about the issues that immediately impact their surrounding area. So sometimes that means that if I'm at a bus station and I see a young woman with her child, I'm probably going to go and engage her on a conversation around childcare. When I've been at the bus stop and I see someone there and it's a hot summer day and I'm like, wow, we really got to fix this bus system. And then we'll just get into a conversation about it. And then we'll say, well, mayor could fix the bus system, but we really have to hold them accountable. And so this again is around like those type of deeper kind of conversations, but that's how you kind of get to it. And then in terms of motivation, what we have found is that, especially through our Voter Stories project, people are just really inspired by people feeling inspired. I know, right? It's like about people just really speaking their truth and really having those kind of conversations. Like I know one story in particular that always touches my heart, that keeps me motivated and has kept others motivated, is that we have someone on our team. Their name was Ryan, and they actually played on the Game-a-thon with us. They had been with us for, I want to say, about a year at that time. And I had asked them a question around, like how they felt about the experience. And they said one thing that they've always appreciated was that they could come here and not feel like they were judged, that they were not judged for not knowing something. And that's so important when it comes to meeting people where they're at and having those kind of conversations to keep people motivated. And so that's the first thing. Now, when it comes to voters in particular, so if we're not talking about just young people, but voters in general, keeping people motivated is definitely looking at down ballot initiatives and looking at things that impact people the most.
Absolutely. And, just to add on to that, it's really meeting people where they are, right? Those issues that are important to them. And that actually ties right back into education. And it also ties back into data collection. So when we are engaging in conversation, asking, engaging in that conversation to identify what those issues are, we can include that information within our suite of tools. So that way, when we are going back into community, we are continuously asking, what are those issues that are important to you? And then when we're in conversations with values aligned elected officials, we're lifting those up. So it's really a cycle. And I see we have another question. Or go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I was gonna say about Shayna's topic. Thank you, Shayna. And I was gonna say, I agree. Like a lot of times they really pushed at these narratives where older folks are patronizing angrily at people for voting is an effective way. And what we have found that it's not at all. In fact, because especially when we start talking about, like for us, we really focus a lot in BIPOC, predominantly Black communities. Voting is a moral question as well, given the history of voter suppression and disenfranchisement for our communities. And so oftentimes engaging someone about voting in a very patronizing or angry or like, why aren't you voting kind of way in an effort to shame them is not an effective tool. Shaming people is not an effective tool for long-term engagement. So if the goal is to get people to vote consistently in every election, shaming is not an effective tool. You may try to shame someone into voting for one election, but overall, you'll find is that people will not vote again after that. What we see, though, is that when we're registering people to vote, roughly about 80% of people that we register to vote in the next election, and those who don't end up voting for the election after that. And so it's really important that we continue, and that's because we continue to have conversations with these folks after we register and vote. And so, again, it's really important that we have these kind of conversations that don't start from places of shame, but that are really about focusing on like what people can have to take control of their lives. Because really, when we think about it, people resign themselves from the political process because they don't feel like they have any control. And so we have to put power into our communities, especially with young people, especially when we look at just the makeup of government itself, where there's a lot of older people who are in political office. We have to change that. And that means that we have to start speaking power into young people and letting them know that they can make these changes and that they can exert some control over the crises that face them.
100%. And, that's why we think message testing is so important, right? Because we do recognize that messaging that is going to attract someone who's maybe a millennial or a Gen Z compared to someone maybe from a different generation, it's going to look a little different, right? But we are noticing that when we have a positive attitude and we are excited about the elections and talking about how their voice will make an impact within their community, it definitely has it resonates on a positive line. And so that's something that we definitely implement within our programs. And something else I wanted to mention too, because we also work with so many young folks, millennial, Gen Z, we ask them directly, right? What attracted you to the program? And so as we are constantly in a matter of evaluation, it's really important for us to be able to take those top lines and best practices and continue to implement them in our programs. And Michelle mentioned a point about just being in continual communication. And that's why integrated voter engagement is so important, because we're having those continual conversations. And just to give an example, during the pandemic, really, especially at the top of the pandemic, when people were losing their jobs, they were trying to figure out how are they going to provide for their family. Voting was likely not their top priority, right? And so what we did is we engaged with those voters and non-voters, right, on just on a level of humanity and recognizing what's going on within our current state, and really building those relationships, right? And then as we're continuing with all of our different campaigns, we're continuously in that conversation and communication with folks in community. And that's why the folks within our universe, the folks that we're connecting with, we have such a high level of voter turnout, because we're building those relationships on the front end.
Yes, thank you all so much for the questions. This also makes me think of the fact too that like sometimes we have to be okay with people telling us no. So I have found that like when it comes to this kind of work, it also means that we have to develop relationships. And so when we're recruiting people, especially sometimes you might have to invest in frequenting an area for multiple weeks before you end up getting a yes. And that's just the nature of it. I have had people before who like went from like, hey, I see you out here every week. No, I'm not registering to vote with you. And then by week like 8, they're like, you know what? You're here all the time doing this thing. I guess I can trust you. I will do this. And so I think from there being able to see them grow and then they'll join the team and then they'll start talking to other people is a really beautiful process. And it's also even great too when we start talking about the issues. I've had people come on the team who, as a reproductive justice organization, we're definitely pro-abortion, but had somebody who came on the team and they told me 3 months after they were on, they were like, hey, I wasn't really down for abortion. I didn't think people should ever get them. And I was like an anti. But after being with you all and like seeing what it means, like I wouldn't personally do it, but I think everyone else should have the right to make that decision for themselves. And that's really what's beautiful about the process is that again, we're able to integrate the issues that matter most to people, again, to expand horizons and also get people to advocate for these certain things, especially around the human rights framework of reproductive justice. And so I'm just always inspired by that story.
These are great questions. We're happy to answer any more that you have.
Oh, you asked if that was an outlier. I missed the last part of your question, Shayna. Oh, yeah, okay. What is your messaging to young BIPOC folks who tell you their vote does not matter? Like, thank you for that question, Jesse. Mashara, did you want to answer?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, going back to two things. One, addressing it from a positive manner, right? So, we are excited about the election. We're excited about making sure that our voices are heard, right? And something else that we're noticing too is that there's a lot of research that has been done in regards to message testing. And so, what we're doing is looking at just analyzing that research to be able to bring into our work. But like I said, we're approaching it from a positive attitude that your voice matters, right? And then it's also a way for them to get involved and become civically engaged. And so, for example, when we are recruiting folks to participate within our campus team, we're letting them know that we want to hear from you and that we're lifting up what matters to you and whatever those issues are within your respective communities, that we're making sure that as we're holding elected officials accountable, that they're hearing directly from young people. And I think when young people recognize that, wow, my state representative or my city council person here's what I have to say, it encourages them to want to get involved because they know that that's one way for them to make a difference.
Yes. And I see the other question about what do we say to people who feel hopeless besides first empathizing? And I say to that, like, I'm more so of like I tailor my responses to people. So that's the first thing I will say. But oftentimes it's really just like we have to dig a little deeper into figuring out like what do you mean by hopeless, right? Because I will tell you now, like I think a lot of people were feeling a little bit hopeless going into the 2020 general election. And I know that was happening across a lot where we were getting these kind of questions of like, what did we do? Things of that nature. And so I think the thing about it is that we still have to we just have to keep it going in a sense that I always tell folks that what inspires me and keeps me motivated and keeps me hopeful is that more people are having the conversations that are necessary to really enact change. So even in like my short lifespan, like I'm only 30 years old, but like I've been about politics for like half of my life. And when I was a teenager, there were not as many people talking about politics in my age group as there are now for those people who were my age then. So it's really important that we continue to put that in context. That even though like things seem hopeless, but they only seem hopeless because people are more aware. Social media has its own vices, but at the same time has enabled us to become much more aware and spread information much more quickly so we can be better informed about these things. And what's really needed and why it's important for organizations like ours and others who are trying to do this work to deeply invest in these things is that you do need a voice that's going to interject some hope there. Because if you continue to look at the doom and gloom news, sometimes that's what's going to happen. And so in terms of what we say to people, it's really by person basis, making sure that we are sticking to a message that speaks about hope, that doesn't shame people. And sometimes you can even just acknowledge it because the way that the systems are designed, they're designed to keep people disinvested from the political process. And if we start from there, then people saying that they feel hopeless or they say that their vote doesn't matter does not seem, because that's what the system was made to do. It was made in a way like I always use the example of 2018 in Georgia, where over 40% of the electorate turned out to vote for our midterm elections in the governor's race with Brian Kemp versus Stacey Abrams, and our election system like folded because it could not handle the capacity of just 40% of the state electorate voting. And so it's really important that we put these things in context to let people know that, like, hey, like things really aren't changing that much because the entire electorate is not voting in the same ways that we vote for major ticket elections. And we have to continue to demystify and push back against the miseducation around who actually has the power to impact our day-to-day lives. Because oftentimes, especially with BIPOC communities and young people, it's hard to talk to people about how their vote's going to change things when their current circumstances are not changing. Which is why we have to change how we're having these kind of conversations and have to stop trying to have these conversations in a big ticket year. Meaning that like in 2020, if you're starting to have a conversation with a young person about why their vote's important, you're too late. We need to start having these conversations now around smaller and local elections to build up community power and keep it consistent. And so I really wanted just to highlight that like it's important to keep these conversations going year round in a way that empowers people and really speaks to like who holds the keys in terms of like the direct impact of our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. And then too, you can register to vote at 17 and a half, right? So let's have conversations about what does engagement and education look like around the voting process earlier on, right? What does it look like to talk about being engaged in ninth grade? So by the time you are able to register to vote and cast your ballot, you are a very well-informed voter, right? And then we also want to celebrate our small wins. We have to recognize that it's taken years, right, to win court cases or taking years to have policy implemented. And we're not going to flip the script overnight, right? But what we can do is build relationships. We can understand what the issues are within community, and we can celebrate those small wins. And I think that that will truly help people have more of a positive outlook when they're thinking about being civically engaged and just really about the entire electoral process. Yes, we do see a couple of comments about sending our presentation. Happy to do that.
Yeah, so we have a couple more minutes if anybody wants to get one last question in.
And Eric, you are right. You can win a vote by just that one vote, win an election by that one vote. That is right. And so, as we think about, for example, one of the counties that we work in, one of the 8 counties is Rockdale County. And what's really interesting is that it's actually only one city, which is Conyers and Rockdale. And so it's a little odd when you think about you can live in the city, but you're not necessarily represented by the city council. You may be represented by the commissioners. And so really kind of going back to like that educational piece around why your vote matters and how your vote can really make that difference in terms of, electing a person whose values align with you and what you believe. Eric, you're right. That is true. And I think that definitely goes back to the educational piece and, thinking about how can we partner, particularly as nonpartisan organizations, how can we partner with schools, both middle schools, high schools, right? And really make sure that we're having conversations with young people so they know who JFK was and, all the other we are not partisan organization, but just understand and know the different, folks within history, and also the folks who are currently running for office, whatever, side they may fall on, but that they're educated on the different platforms.
Yeah, and I think the thing is too, and I think this kind of also goes back to like demystifying the conversations, is that it's like there are some who do know, like, and I think it's really about us, finding young people who are also there who can continue to spread their message and amplifying them. And this is kind of where it goes back into like uplifting existing young leadership. And the reason I say that is because I'm a young person who like studied history and politics and knew all about it in high school, and was fortunate enough that someone poured it to me that way. So I always want to like push back a little bit when we make general statements like that, to make sure that we're leaving room for that, and that again we're uplifting young people in that way. I think the other thing is too that I'm thinking about as well when we talk about education is that, especially for a lot of young people who are coming of age, 18, 19, 20 years old, the conversation, there's never really a true conversation around voting that really does need to take place. In essence, around, if you're a young person and you decide to move, what does it mean to actually register to vote in the place that you live? Like letting students, people who are going to colleges or universities, know what that process looks like in terms of if they want to get an absentee ballot, or if they need to register where they are. Because I know that for myself personally, that happened to me. And I was all about politics. Everybody was like, oh, she knows about politics. But I did not know that my home state would not allow me to get an absentee ballot, even though I was a student out of state. And so we have to, again, have these kind of conversations about the nuances of it, because these things are different state by state, that impact people in so many different ways. So then we're left to wonder, okay, young people are going to colleges and universities at a higher rate than other generations, but also at the same time are not able to vote. But we're not looking at some of these disparities. And that's also too why we frequent college campuses and talking to them and encouraging them to change their address to their university address, right? And also too, like the education component, talking about how like even when we talk about census counts, right? You're counted at your university address because you spend 9 months there. So like, right, like, so it's really about making sure that we're kind of like having those kind of conversations, and make sure that we're continuing to center that and uplift young people in that way, and that we're doing the work that's necessary to find those young people who are there because they are there, and they do know, and providing them the resources and the tools to continue to recruit others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, from this presentation, I certainly hope that for our folks who are based in Georgia, if you'll know some young people who are looking to get involved, send them our way. We'll be more than happy to get them engaged in this process around voting, elections, and really just becoming more active within their communities.
Yes. And thank you, Malika. Malika is our CEO. And our co-founder. And so make sure to stay engaged with us. You can check us out at womenengaged.org. We have a lot of great, amazing things that are coming up. We're celebrating 7 years of doing this amazing work. We'll have virtual activities from November 15th through November 19th. And so also, if you're in the Atlanta area, you can sign up to get more information on our website. And as Mashara mentioned earlier, we have some amazing work going on. We're currently working around the municipal elections that are going on. We're preparing for a legislative cycle, and we know next year is going to be a very high stakes election for our gubernatorial seats. And so we hope that you all can stay connected. You can also follow us on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. We have all of that. And so you can see a little bit more and stay in touch with the amazing work that our team is doing at these various intersections.
And that concludes our presentation for the day. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. And thank you, Netroots, for having us.